Let's talk about Indian title. I think we already got started with this a little bit. Um, Recognized Indian title and other parts. Um, we're all familiar with the Fifth Amendment and the clause that requires the federal government to provide just compensation for any taking in which the federal government takes the land. Well, that's often the case with when a local or state or federal government declares eminent domain for some reason, like building a dam, flooding an area. Um, the United States Corps of Engineers, for example, has would in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s um, buy out landowners in order to produce these big reservoirs. Well, that's an example of how eminent domain works. Number one, there are two requirements for eminent domain in the United States. The first requirement is that the private owners of the land that is taken have to be compensated at fair market value. Right? That's called the just compensation clause. So fair market value is has to be provided. Fair market value at the time of the taking. Okay. Number two, the land that was taken has to be put into a public benefit use. So it has to be, for something like a reservoir for, water supply or a road or something like that. So eminent domain sometimes requires the government, federal, state, local, to to take private property, but our Constitution protects those people who are who are impacted by eminent domain. However, um, we have examples where um, Indian title becomes subject to eminent domain. All right. So the example here, I won't try to elaborate too much on it, but um, the Shoshone tribe. Some people say Shoshone. I'm not really sure what's correct. I've always said Shoshone. The Shoshones on the Wind River Reservation were moved in 1868, and it wasn't too long afterward that their not so um, welcome the Northern Arapaho, who were sort of their enemies, were also moved in on the same reservation. Basically, the Shoshone put up with this, and the Indian agents tried to work it out, um, but they kept getting put off and put off and put off, and the federal government in Washington basically gave them the cold shoulder and didn't did not do much. Eventually, in this between 1870 and 1891, okay, this is like well into the reservation history. The federal government just said, well, we're just going to keep the Arapahoes there, and we're Congress, so the Shoshones, they just can't do anything about it. Sorry, but this is the way it is. Well, so that of course became an example of a taking, and the Shoshones, of course, they didn't wait for the Indian Claims Commission. They filed a claim in the United States Court of Claims in 1927. Okay, so they were organized enough to do that. So the issue here is the Shoshones have a legitimate gripe that the federal government gave land on their reservation to another tribe, totally different tribe, and they were never compensated for that. And so they say, this is what needs to be done here. You need to compensate us, or you compensate the tribe for that, that lost territory, that lost land. The federal government said, well, okay, we did. That was a taking. That was wrong. The government does owe you money. And remember, the Arapahoes arrived in 1890, 1891, the Arapahoes arrived in 1869. The government declared that the Arapahoes would live on the Wind River Reservation in 1891, and the Shoshones bring suit in 1927. So we've got a pretty long spread here, right? So the United States Court of Claims rules in favor of the Shoshone, but the question became, how do we calculate the claim? Was the land taken in 1869 when the Arapahoes arrived? Was the land did the taking occur when the Bureau of Indian Affairs formally said that the Arapahoes will just live there and they live on the Wind River Reservation? Or did the taking occur when the suit was brought up to the Court of Claims in 1927? So the question is, if you were the Shoshone tribe, which date would you prefer the court recognize as the date of the taking? Steve?
The earliest possible?
Well, I don't know. Why?
Well, the one that would net me the most money for the consumer price index for what it's going to be.
Yeah, the rate of you just pull out your inflation calculator and see what the is worth, right? Yeah, it was an interesting question. Well, the tribe actually asked for the 1927 value, and the federal government, for some reason, went with an 1878 date. And that was, the federal government argued for the earlier date because the fair market value of the land was less in 1878 than it was in 1891. So the government said, well, let's just go with when was the land the cheapest? So 1878. Let's see now. The interest calculations, however, if you look at the balance, if you have a really low balance, but compound interest over many decades, maybe that would be higher than the fair market value in 1927. But apparently the tribe had done the research, and they wanted the 1927 figure. What's the punchline here? The important thing to remember is, and I think what happened was they did it all, and it didn't really matter so much. It wasn't a very large amount. But what showed up, or what was discovered in this litigation, was that recognized Indian title can validate tribal claims to land under United States law, while unceded Indian land, cannot have the same protections under the Fifth Amendment. Okay, so put it like this, and what this is kind of building up to another case that's really important. The Shoshone's Wind River Reservation was carved out of land from their original cession. Okay, it was recognized title, and it was it's based on a treaty acknowledgement. So the federal government says we recognize this as your land, um, and that generally, well, since it was recognized title, the United States, um, the Fifth Amendment just compensation clause was activated for the tribe. The problem, however, arrives when if you have a native group who has never ceded land to the federal government. Okay, they're a recognized Indian tribe, but they have never ceded any land, and they lose the land. Then they are not protected by the Fifth Amendment. Unceded Indian lands cannot have the protections of the Fifth Amendment. Um, and so, where does that one come in? The case is called the T-Hit-Ton versus the United States, and this claim or this case it's one of the more important ones. It was 1955. It was right before Alaska became a state, and it was one of these too big to fail messes. Alaska was still a territory. Many different native groups living in Alaska. Okay. Well, this relatively small, tiny group of people um, uh, basically brought a suit claiming 350,000 acres and 150 square miles of water, and they said this is ours. It was taken, and we want to be compensated for it. And what the federal government said was, there's never been any recognition. There's never been any recognition of the title here, so there can't be any compensation. So, in other words, I'm trying to paraphrase here. The government will only recognize Indian title if that title has been, excuse me, the government will recognize Indian title, but it will deny Indian title when a claim is brought to it for just compensation. Does that make any sense? So in the case of the T-Hit-Ton Indians in Alaska, Alaska was a federal territory. The tribes didn't have treaties with the federal government, so there was no presence of a recognized Indian title. It was all unceded land. Okay, so how do you deal with something like that? In 1958, Alaska became the 49th state. You've got a huge area with lots and lots of natural resources. How in the world are you going to deal with this fact that there are indigenous tribes all over the place that have never signed treaties with the United States and therefore don't have any recognized title? They have unceded Aboriginal title, but they've never made treaties, and of course the United States won't make any more treaties. So that's the problem. All right. Well, what it did was it led to, in 1971, what's referred to as the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and we will dive into that later in the course. There was also a Maine Indian Settlement Act, similar to it, kind of a smaller scale. What that was in 1971, that the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was put together by the during the Nixon administration. So another one of those Nixon things, and it was generally considered to be a win for everybody, a win-win-win situation. Very unique, but what it did was it made Alaska completely different from the rest of Native America in terms of the land title. Okay, so we'll get into why, and it's basically it made the what are called Alaska Native villages. They're not called federally recognized Indian tribes in Alaska. They're Alaska Native villages, and those received sort of like shares in a large pool of or large account that would continue to grow as Alaska's natural resources were utilized. So it was generally considered a win on all sides. The native peoples were good with it. Of course, they agreed to it. The state was good with it, and the federal government seems to have done something right. Okay, the Oneida case. This is in Land One Indian title still. The city of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. Somebody impress me and tell me what happened in this case. Show me that you've read it. It doesn't have to be real accurate. Just where did it take place?
In New York.
Ah, very good. New York. The Oneida Indian Nation of New York. Yeah. What did it involve, Sarah?
Weren't they trying to buy parcels of land in city limits and remake them like Indian title?
Well, what they did was they purchased land, right? And then they assumed, because they owned it, that it was not taxable by the state. So when the state, levied property taxes, they said, well, we're an Indian tribe and we own this land and sorry. Okay. So did they win? Huh?
I don't think so.
They didn't win. They claimed, or they in this case they went to court. Well, the city, I guess, went to court against them, and their defense was that they have sovereign immunity and they cannot be taxed by a state. They sought an injunction against the city of Sherrill, New York, and they said, we're an Indian tribe, you can't tax us. But this brings up the whole idea of diminishment, okay? The idea of diminishment. Because, this land was part of the Oneida Nation, the Oneida land base that they ceded. When did they cede that land? Yeah, so not only were they buying land, they were sort of purchasing land that they once owned as a tribe. So they said, this is ours. We bought it back from you.
Which wasn't that a part of it too, where it was land, we bought it back, which means that it had already passed over onto into non-Indian hands. Exactly. And was sold, so therefore extinct.
What had happened, they were attempting to claim land that had the Indian title extinguished. Well, they said, well, yeah, but it's even within our own unceded lands, and the court said, sorry, pay your property taxes. But this brings up the idea of diminishment. So the Oneida Indian Nation had they had ceded the land over 200 years ago, and of course it had been settled by non-Indians, and by purchasing it and getting it as a fee simple title, they assumed it would become Indian country again. But that's not the case. And if you go back to the Tehit-Ton case, which I didn't discuss very well at all, whenever the government or whenever a group tries to claim um, Indian title as fee simple title, it will not work. Okay, so fee simple title can never be Indian country, according to the rules of the government here. So if you want to make it Indian country, you have to turn over the land to the federal government, and the federal government will basically condemn it. Okay, and if it's condemned, well, doesn't mean anything negative necessarily, but they're going to place it back in federal trust. Okay, so it's non-taxable. But what else? What else does federal trust do? It's not all good things. Well, I'm sorry, I kind of got off track there. In the case of the Oneida, what was kind of going on, the idea would be that, well, at least the federal government sort of made the argument that, if you start having little parcels of Indian country all over the place, then there's going to be problems with jurisdiction. Okay? And that's incredibly ironic, right? Because basically it's like, well, we can't have this because it would create checkerboarding, all right? Yet Indian reservations are checkerboarded and, all over the place. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting case. But we know for sure that the other side of that is that the United States federal government now has a procedure, and this case was pretty recent, 2004. Yeah. In 2004, that was long after the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. And the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act provided a procedure for tribes to place land into federal trust. Okay, so there was already a way to do it. You just can't assume it's going to happen just by purchasing it. Okay. Now going back to that idea of buying land, like the Cherokee Nation buying farmland and stuff, we know that they can place it into federal trust, right? And in fact, a lot of Indian tribes are today purchasing land as investments. The Chickasaw Nations are buying up cattle pasture and operating farms and ranches and things as a tribe, as part of the tribal industries. But do they put it in trust? Do they put the land that they purchase into trust to avoid taxes or whatever? Most of the time they don't, because having land in federal trust is a bigger hassle than paying taxes on it. And they, if the land is not in federal trust, they can easily liquidate it. Or if they, say, for example, in fact, I heard this example described by Neil McCaleb one time, who works for the Chickasaw Nation, and he was discussing the process that tribes go through to waive their sovereign immunity. Okay, the tribes have to agree to be sued if they want to be sued, but nobody wants to do business with a tribe if they can't be sued. If they go back on a contract, if they break a contract, you can't sue them unless they agree to be sued beforehand. So the tribes everywhere, basically, if they're doing business, then they go through a process of waiving tribal sovereign immunity in their contracts so that they can be sued. Otherwise, nobody would do business with them. So it's just and in some ways, being a sovereign is kind of a liability, right? Um, so the and if they had, say for example, they owned a bunch of heavy equipment, um, and it was trust property, it was owned by the federal government, they couldn't sell it. They might be
This it allows them, I guess, to be more diverse. Simply in like take the pandemic for example. If they cannot get relief or support or the money quick enough from the government, they can sell an asset, or it'd be easier to offload off sovereignty or through that to go ahead and become more liquid to bring back to
Mhm.
the nation they
Yeah.
needed. So it makes a lot more financial sense
So
to be on both sides of the fence.
federal trust property is not liquid at all. It's
Yeah.
pretty much dead. It's pretty much not going to be used, or not sellable at all.